Okay, we're going to begin looking at the origins of the French Revolution. McKay likes to tackle this chapter by discussing the revolution in politics as a period of revolutionary activity, because it really is. It's the culmination of the Enlightenment into real life, everyday political terms. The French Revolution is preceded by the American Revolution. In North America. And we talk about this revolutionary era. We're really talking about the Enlightenment bringing about a period of political change in which governments are going to be constructed around Enlightenment ideals, and the idea of republicanism. That means governments without monarchs is going to really gain ground outside of the one place it had been in at one point in the Netherlands. So when we look at this revolution that came to France in 1789, it's going to go through several phases. It's going to go through a constitutional monarchy phase of the revolution, oftentimes referred to as the liberal phase of the revolution. It's going to go through a radical phase of the revolution led by the Jacobins, and then end with Napoleon and his new empire. And as we go through this, I want us to think about this idea of the ideals of the Enlightenment being a great inspiration in these revolutions. And then in France in particular, whether the French Revolution was a success or not. That's going to be one of our themes and one of our growing debates as we get to the end of this unit. But when we look at these revolutions created by Enlightenment ideals, you could argue that it also occurs outside of France and America as well when we talk about the slave revolt of Saint-Domingue, which starts as the largest slave revolt in the history of the Americas, but is going to end with the freeing of Saint-Domingue into Haiti in the formation of a government based solely on the French Revolution and Enlightened ideals. So we're going to really kind of look at this and how this plays out. So what are some of these causes of the French Revolution that we've alluded to already in class? The driving force behind the early phases of the French Revolution are going to be the bourgeoisie. Those are going to be the wealthy traders that came out of the commercial revolution. These are the people that got money, they're educated, they're heavily involved in the Enlightenment, but they're also disenfranchised by the estate system in France. So they're paying a lot of the taxes, and they're in a lot of ways more educated than the nobility, but they have no say in government. The nobility don't have much say in government, but they've openly given up that say in order to have tax exemptions. The bourgeoisie don't even have that. So when we look at this this revolution in France, we're really talking about social changes, talking about political crisis, the influence of Enlightened ideals, the development of this idea of a public sphere and people's participation in that sphere, and the bourgeoisie are going to be the driving force behind this. So if we really simplify it, what happens in France that causes the French Revolution? It is the collision of several themes of history in French history. The rise of absolutism is going to collide with the Enlightenment and the ideals of the Enlightenment and constitutional monarchy and rights of the people and participation and the sharing of power. That's all going to come into collision. But in the third part, it's going to come into the social side. It's going to deal with the poverty and the estate system that actually predated absolutism. The estate system in France is a medieval Capetian invention, and it's going to stick around. So these three things culminate and to build up this revolution. And the spark is going to be economic, financial, and agricultural crisis that is going to spark this revolution. So when we look at the estate system, just a reminder, you got to keep in mind the first estate is the members of the church, the clergy. The second estate is the nobility, and the third estate is everyone else. And the third estate is the most indistinguishable estate. It's made up of a lot of different people. When we look at these breakdowns by 1789, the origins of the French Revolution, the first estate only makes up about 100,000 people. The second estate, about 400,000. Remember that then there's two types of nobilities. There's the robe and the sword nobility in France, and France has more nobles because of the making nobles in any other country. But France is also the most populous country in Western Europe. So we look at that and we examine that to the third estate. The third estate is about 27.5 million people in 1789. So the third estate is the bulk of the country. So on one hand, it doesn't seem to make that big of a difference that the first and second estate don't really pay any taxes, and it makes sense that the third estate should because they're the majority of the population. However, the state system in absolutist France had created such a massive wealth gap that the reality is that those small number of people, at maybe 500,000 people at the top of the estate system, controls the majority of the wealth of the country and benefits from absolutism when the other ones don't. So if we look at the first estate, they own 10% of the land, but was only 0.004% of the population. So the church is an incredibly large landowner. They only paid a voluntary gift once every 5 years to the state and was otherwise exempt from paying taxes. And if we got to keep this in mind, that every time they levied the tithe, which the church asked 10% for their population to be given to the church, they're essentially actually a taxing institution in France. They're another way that people are being taxed outside of this state. So really, the first estate takes more wealth out of France than it ever puts back into France, even though it is involved in charitable giving, as the church always is. So it's pulling more out than it's putting back in. The second estate owned 25% of the land outright. That was the land titled to the nobles that they owned based on their noble titles, and this is particularly true of the sword nobility, and controlled much more land, a land they purchased along the way. But they're only about 0.014% of the population, and they already own well over a fourth of the land in the country. They're lightly taxed, but for all intents and purposes, not really taxed at all. They're given almost complete tax exemptions, despite the fact that they control most of the productive land and wealth of the country. This was done in exchange for political compliance and absolutism. This goes back to our debate about, was absolutism a myth or not in France? They were being given an exemption in order to give a political power to the king. So when we look at those two estates, they're controlling huge amounts of wealth but giving nothing back. So if we look at the third estate, by far the majority of the population, over 90% of all the people in France fall into this estate. And as such, it is a mix of classes. It's composed of traditional masses, like we think of the peasantry or the urban poor, but some growing and changing classes, urban skilled labor, doctors, lawyers, in the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie was composed of the merchants and lawyers and doctors and professionals and educated people that had money. And by the time we're in 1789, some of these bourgeoisie have as much, or if not more, as some people in the nobility. So they're quite wealthy, but they're a smaller portion of the third estate. By far, the bulk of the third estate is composed of peasantry in the countryside, poor people living day to day with no savings whatsoever. And that means that the bulk of the population that are paying the taxes is the peasantry. However, I want us to focus on the urban poor as well, because they're going to be driving force in the revolution. But leading in the early stages, the bourgeoisie. So they're not poor living day to day, but the bourgeoisie are educating the Enlightenment in what representation. They don't like the fact that they're making lots of new income for the state, and in the end, they're supporting absolutism when they're not benefiting from absolutism, like those of the second estate and those that are going to court and those that are staying at Versailles. So when we look at this key developments that are going to lead to the French Revolution in 1789, one is the fluid nature of the nobility. The rise of the robe nobility is going to dilute the nobility. Within the robe nobility and some of the nobility, we start to see a growing liberalism, but also, more importantly, I mean, we could talk about like Montesquieu or other nobles that were inspired by the Enlightenment, but the majority of nobles are heavily invested in the old regime, what they call the ancien regime. The strongest place we see the influence of the Enlightenment is by far with the bourgeoisie, and in the growing, quite frankly, most of them which are growing capitalists. In 1789. By the time we're in 1789, we're firmly out of the commercial revolution, and we're into the first industrial revolution, and capitalism is becoming very open. It's becoming a way that people are that are that are changing their status. All right, we will approach the continuation of this in just a minute.